Hello, I'm Mark Baer. Hello, I'm Mark Baer. You're watching the YourTown television program. My guest, Mark Governor, composer, musician. Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's just get started. You've done everything from the music to The Hobbit. You've worked with Iggy Pop. You've done it all. Now you're here, and you've been working with Folktale Wineries. And so let's start at the beginning. How did it all begin?
Well, I think my musical background started when I was a kid. I didn't take classical music lessons like most people who do what I do did young. Really, that didn't happen until my teen years. So my early introduction to music was really my parents' LP player, and they belonged to this thing called the Columbia Record Club.
Yeah.
And these random records would come in, some that they ordered and some that they didn't know, gets on a pile. And when they were gone, I'd listen to all those records, and it got me really, really into music. I also taught myself how to play piano, which they weren't aware of for a while, that I knew how to play piano. And then that led to, in high school, I did a big shift in my senior year of high school. I was in an alternative school, and the teacher said, you're really musically talented. You might want to think about this. And I switched my major. I had a scholarship a full scholarship in writing, and I switched it to music. And then that was Northeastern University, which then told me I couldn't switch it to music, so I left. And then I did private music study, and that led me to, University of Massachusetts, getting to study for a little bit with Aaron Copland, and then landing in Hollywood. And that's kind of the start of the story.
So let's, I just love this story. I mean, first of all, I don't know if people understand what a big deal it was that you met Aaron Copland, who is kind of one of our landmark composers.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the story about, tell me why he picked you.
Oh, well, it's a funny story. So there was this limited series of lectures at Harvard that wound up being one of the last actual classes that he taught. And so my composition professor at the time said, you should apply for this because, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And in order to get into the class, you had to submit a string quartet that would then be reviewed, and, some people would get chosen and some wouldn't. And so I had never written a string quartet before this. I knew about it, but I had not written my own, and was struggling. And once again, this professor said, "Well, go with what you know. Like, what are you passionate about?" And what I was passionate about was Jimi Hendrix and Pete Townsend and Led Zeppelin and all this, hard rock music of the time. So I used that as musical material and created a string quartet based on all those themes, and submitted that. And then to my surprise, I got into the class. And then when I got there, most of the other people had pretty serious music backgrounds. They had studied since they were 12 years old. Most of the people were going to Harvard, which is where the course was, the lectures were. And after 2 or 3 meetings, I was feeling really out of my depth. Not that I couldn't catch up, but I just felt like, what am I doing here? And so I stayed after, and I approached him, and I said, Mr. Copland, I'm so thrilled to be in your class, and I'm so thrilled to be doing this, but I have no idea why you chose me. And he pulled the string quartet out of his little case where he had, and he said, I just had to meet the maniac who wrote this thing. And that pretty much defined my career from that point on.
That's just a great story. And so this leads you to Hollywood, and the great Roger Corman.
Yeah.
And as we know of Roger Corman, the king of the B movie, and and so many people got their starts with him. I believe Jack Nicholson was one of them.
Yeah.
And there's this impression that he was kind of this schlocky kind of guy, but he was a very sophisticated, very suave man. And so let's talk about that experience.
Yeah, it was. That is true about Roger. That even though people know him from the B movies, first directing them and then producing them, some people don't realize he also produced "I Never Promised You a Rose Garden," which was a big art house movie at the time, and his personal taste was very high level.
Yeah.
But he knew how to make money.
Yeah.
And I think his thing was, he said, "I've never lost money on a film." He used to do this thing where he would have an artist create a poster, and he'd have a title and a poster, and then he'd take it to a film market, and he'd sell the film based on that, and then he'd come back and say, "Okay, we have $200,000. We have to make this movie. That's how much money I have." And
it's really smart, actually.
Yeah. It was he was a genius of that.
Yeah.
And so for me, actually, the way I got involved was I had been doing some documentaries, scoring some documentaries, and just getting my feet wet in film scoring when I had moved to Los Angeles. And a friend of mine who was an editor was working on this movie at that time was called Charlie Guitar. I think it got changed, the title changed to Beach Balls because the poster had two beach balls and these girls holding beach balls, so whatever. And it required someone that could deal with all this rock music that was live shot in the movie, as well as write a score. And, I had a foot in both worlds and always have. So my editor friend recommended me. And basically it was Christmas Eve that I had the meeting with the producer who, said, "Look, it's Christmas Eve and I want to get out of here. Can you do this movie?" And I said, "Sure." And that's kind of how you get hired at Corman. He said, "You looks like you got the background, I like you, let's do it." And there was a lot of camaraderie there. Roger was always on the set. He always came by. He was very involved. He was not hands off. I did 5 movies for him in a row. I think one every couple of months. The way it worked there is if you did a good job, by the time you were wrapping up that film, they'd be dropping another one on you. A director would come by. As you mentioned, not just Jack Nicholson, but Ron Howard, Martin Scorsese, quite a few directors, Jonathan Demme, all had gotten their start there. And my crew was the one right after Jonathan Demme and James Cameron, who had just left.
Wow.
And Jamie Horner was the big composer,
Wow.
and he had just left.
Wow.
So that's who just went out the door, and then we were the new
kids.
the new kids coming
Yeah.
in.
Wow.
And it was, you learned on the job. That really was my film school, and it was great because the thing about Roger was, in any other film company, if you wanted to be, say, an editor, you would start as like the person doing coffee and the assistant to the assistant, then the assistant editor, and then the editor of, maybe part of it. You'd have to work your way up. Whereas, it was sink or swim.
You just right in the deep end.
Yeah, okay, you're the editor, go for it. The same with being a composer.
That's great. Then so you became a composer, and then over time you also produced records. So how did you make that transition? And let's talk about your that part of it.
Yeah, it was simultaneous, and that sort of was that also came from the Corman years, really. Most of the films that I was involved with as a composer also had bands in them, and I had been in bands, growing up in punk rock bands and in new wave bands, and so once again, there's not a lot of money here. So if you were the composer, you were in charge of all the music, and that meant you're the music supervisor. Oh. And if there were songs in the movie, if you were a songwriter like I was, then well, you're going to write those songs too. Uh-huh. So I wound up, writing songs and actually being in several of the movies as myself, playing the songs, in some weird character getup. And because of that, I got to work with the bands that they had hired for the films, on the soundtrack, and then that sort of brought me into the Los Angeles music scene at that time, which was really vibrant.
What year are we here?
We're talking early 90s, and so you would have had X, the band, and Concrete Blonde, and who I worked with, and we did songs together, and a lot of like that LA new wave. Punk was kind of it had been there already.
Yeah.
Danny Elfman and Oingo Boingo,
Yeah.
all that was going on at that
Yeah.
time. And so it was a really fun time to be involved, and it was really open. So I became a record producer originally by producing these songs for the soundtracks. And then, you make friends and you have time off in between films, and why not be in a recording studio doing that?
Wow. So that's so cool. And and I just want to talk about Iggy Pop before I see the clock going down, so I want to make sure we get Iggy in. So tell me about working with Iggy Pop.
Okay, well that was a very interesting situation. So Johnny Depp directed one movie, as far as I know, and the movie is called The Brave. It's a very dark film that he was drawn to. He read the script, and he's in it. Marlon Brando's in it. And Johnny and Iggy Pop had been in a Jim Jarmusch movie called Dead Man, and had met on the set, and Johnny asked Iggy, "Do you want to score my film?" And Iggy said, "Sure." So, and then they moved forward with that. Now on Dead Man, Neil Young did the score, and the way he did it was he watched the film like once or twice, played the guitar, and Jim Jarmusch went, "All right, we're done." So Iggy might have thought that's how you do it. So they had been struggling for a while, and then I got a call from my agent who said, "Okay, they're looking for someone. Johnny really wants strings in this movie and wants a lot of orchestration, and they're looking for someone who can do that, but also
produce the music.
Deal with Iggy.
Yeah.
Deal with rock and these rock musicians and all that." And I thought it sounded like a blast. So I came to the studio, and I found out from the music supervisor about 5 people before me had been hired, some of them famous, and either left in frustration or were asked to leave and really what I realized, they were all trying to fix Iggy's music. And what he would do was he would watch the screen and block chords on the piano and sing in his Iggy voice. And then, hand it over, and now he had his band, his guitarist would come in, and, he had a percussionist that played everything, who was really cool, actually. And then that had to become score. So rather than try to fix it, which other people did, like iron it out and put it in, I just went with it, figured out, there's a measure of 6, a measure of 3, a measure of 4, and it was kind of complicated. And then arranged it for strings, and then came in, and that was right. That was correct. And so then we bonded, and it wound up, Iggy and Johnny and I spent a lot of time in the Larrabee Sound in Hollywood, just creating the score. And different friends of Johnny would come, Maria McKee, different soloists or guitarists that were friends of his would come in and do the soundtrack together. Okay. And sadly, that soundtrack was never released. I have it. And the movie, it premiered at Cannes, got a standing ovation, and later Johnny was eviscerated in the press, and he was so hurt. He pulled it from a release. So
no one's ever seen it?
It's out there. It's been on the Sundance Channel. Uh-huh. If you look for The Brave, I believe it was released in Korea. So look for it. It's actually a pretty good movie. It's really dark. Really, really. It's not a date movie.
So let's get to the... I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about The Hobbit as well, because people know this.
Yeah.
So what was that experience like, and what was your part?
So, this often confuses people. So Howard Shore wrote the score to The Hobbit, and it was all recorded down in New Zealand for the most part. All The Hobbit has extended editions, so there are these DVD sets, and so there's 3 hours of the movie, and then I think a total of 24 hours of additional material. So the 24 hours was my job. And so I was in charge of all the music for all that additional material, the extended editions. And what Howard didn't do was create indigenous music. So what's the dwarf music? What's the elf music? And so that became my job, which was really fun.
So you have 24 hours, so that's terrific. You're not so constipated. You can really stretch.
Yeah, well, it was more like, oh my God, how are we going to fill all this score time? So it was a really interesting, because I had some of Howard's music. They gave me all the multi-tracks, so I would arrange and adapt the different, that. I would create new music, And that was based on heavy interaction with the producer and director I worked with, who worked with Peter Jackson, who would say, well, I'm not sure the Woodland Elves would have this instrument. Maybe it would be this instrument, maybe. And so we created the subworld, which, as you know, Hobbit fans go really, really deep.
Yeah.
And so in those, all that additional material, the side stories following the characters, deeper into their story, even how they made the armor, how they did the special effects, all that is scored.
It's almost like a video game.
It's deep like that.
Yeah.
And it's really like you could watch a documentary on the armor and have the whole story of this sword was made by this mythical character and came all the way up.
Wow.
So scoring that was fantastic, really fun.
So let's also talk stage musicals, rock operas. You've spread yourself around.
Yeah, and after I had scored Pet Sematary 2, I took a break. And I created a rock opera that was based on the Scarlet Letter called Shame, that's had several productions on the East Coast in LA and also in Berlin. That one's coming back. It's very relevant to the Me Too movement right now. I've also collaborated with a guitarist from Barcelona on this musical called Possession, the Legend of El Rojo, which is about a haunted guitar and uses flamenco gypsy music.
Wow.
In both cases, they're unusual. It's not your typical Broadway musical form. The rock opera obviously uses rock music. They both follow the stories pretty well, though.
Wow. And then, your new live films project.
Yeah. So here in Carmel, actually,
and creating music for silent films as well for this.
Yeah. Yeah. So here in Carmel. The Carmel Film Festival, which sadly has closed, but I hear may rise again, asked me to do something for their opening night, and I found a silent film called The Unknown, which starred Lon Chaney, not Lon Chaney Sr., and Joan Crawford.
Wow.
And was shot in Pebble Beach.
Wow.
So that had to be the one.
Wow.
So I created a new score for it. And
how did you even find out about that?
I just dug through. I love PD material in general.
Yeah.
And I dug through a silent film archive, and I found all these films from that period. Most of them, unfortunately, the film doesn't exist. And this one had been preserved. And then when you see it, you can see the Del Monte Hotel. You know where they are.
Wow.
And so, I created a new score for that, and we performed it live and premiered it live at the Carmel Film Festival. And now that's going to be a touring thing where we'll go to different cities and do not only that score live, but next year is a watershed year, and we'll be doing more films and more live scores.
Wow. Thank you. I'm with Mark Governor. Mark Governor will be back for another segment. This is Mark Baer. You're watching the YourTown television program, and stay tuned.